Hello, my name is Harzing and I'm a professor of international management, staff development lead and research mentor at Middlesex University Business School. This recording is part of a set of 6 which make up the preparation for Middlesex University Writing Bootcamp. Although we're open to papers targeted at any stage of development in the bootcamp and targeted at any journal, we focus in particular on writing for top journals that desk reject a large proportion of their submissions without even sending the paper out for reviews. Our aim is thus to ensure that your paper has the best possible chance of getting into the peer review process. The first session consists of an introduction to the bootcamp and the development of the publishing landscape. In the second session, we then explain how to craft a descriptive and memorable title. In the third session, we explain how to write polished abstracts that include all relevant information and guide the editor towards choosing the best possible reviewers for your paper. The fourth session deals with the introduction of the paper and explains its crucial role in positioning the paper in the scholarly landscape that you're trying to contribute to. Session 5 then deals with the concluding section of your paper and outlines how important it is to end on a high note. We also discuss the strategic role of referencing in this session. In the 6th and final session, we talk about the importance of writing a good letter to the editor, having your paper proofread, and about all the other little things you can do to give your paper the best possible chance of surviving the desk reject process. And then for those of you who are more visually oriented, here is an overview of the 6 sessions on just one slide. Almost there. Day 3, Session 1, Writing Conclusions. As a general tip, many slides have a URL in the bottom part of the slide that you can look at for further information. This one is a blog post I wrote up for last year's bootcamp. Now, in the first 4 sessions of this writing bootcamp, we've looked at how to see submitting your paper to a journal as being part of a scholarly conversation. We've also looked at 3 distinct elements of your manuscript in detail. First of all, creating a descriptive and memorable title. Second, writing an effective abstract. And third, writing a good introduction that is a mini version of the paper. So now, in this 5th session of the bootcamp, we will look at the final section of the paper, the concluding section. I will explain the role of this concluding section and the mistakes that many authors make in this section. And I will also give you some key examples of what I consider to be effective conclusions. In this 5th session of the bootcamp, we'll also look at the strategic role of referencing in your paper and very, very briefly at the remaining elements of your paper, such as the literature review, the methods and the results section. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that after we've covered the conclusion section. Now, what needs to go in a concluding section? Most journals do expect to have this concluding section or sometimes a paragraph of a bigger section. And they're generally between 10 lines to a full page. And the concluding section should really not include any new information that hasn't yet been covered in the paper. It should really be a concise summary of the entire paper. So when you read the conclusion, you have a summary of the entire paper. And it should end by reiterating your key contributions that you're making in this paper in a few sentences. So what is your key contribution or key contributions to the scholarly conversation? Now, the specific format of this concluding section really again depends on the discipline and the journal. In terms of disciplines, in economics, conclusions are often one long section that reflects on the results. So you have the results section and then one long concluding section. In this case, I'm really talking about the last paragraph in this section. In most management and marketing journals, you will find that reflecting on the results is done in what is called a discussion section, and the conclusion section is either a separate section or maybe a subheading in the discussion section. I promised I would talk about the most common mistake that academics make in writing the conclusion section. And this happens even in published conclusion sections. So I'm not saying if you make this mistake, your article will necessarily be rejected, but I think your article will be much less impactful if you make this mistake. What I often see is that people end their paper with the limitations of their paper. They've been told that every study, every paper has limitations, and you need to be clear about what the limitations and boundaries of your paper are. That's absolutely true, and you absolutely need to do that. But don't end your paper with the limitations, not even if you match them with future research. And to try and give you an analogy of this, if you're meeting with someone, then you end the meeting with all the positive things and the things you agreed on. You're not ending the meeting with all the things you didn't agree on or the things you disliked in the meeting. In a conclusion, you need to have a strong final sentence that has the key takeaway of your research, the key strengths of your research, not the limitations of your research. It also needs to be the contributions of your research. Don't talk about research that other people need to do in the future. It really needs to, if you read the final sentence of your article, it really needs to leave readers with a sense of satisfaction that they've read something meaningful. And they really should be able to grasp that contribution by reading only the abstract and the conclusion. In the abstract, you often promise a lot about what you will do in the paper. But then if your concluding section is mostly about the limitations of your paper, then the implicit message you're sending to the reader is that, well, we had lots of great plans and ideas and lots of things we wanted to do, but ultimately our paper has so many limitations, it's a bit rubbish, so we need much further research, and you might as well not have bothered reading this paper. Obviously, that's not literally what you're saying, but that's the feeling that readers might get from reading a concluding section that focuses mostly on your paper's limitations. I also promised I would give you a few examples of what I think are effective concluding sections. And I've taken these examples from my own papers. And I'll be perfectly honest, I really didn't follow the recommendations that I proposed to you now in each and every one of my papers. But I did do so in quite a few. So I've taken some of these as an example. This was a paper in the field of scientometrics or bibliometrics, published in the journal Scientometrics, and it looked at a few different data sources, the Web of Science, Scopus and Google Scholar, and it looked at the extent to which publications and citations in these databases differed. We took a sample, a representative sample of academics in about 35 different subdisciplines, and also looked at whether these data sources had different disciplinary coverage. So the high-level summary that was the start of our conclusion section was a comparative study of publications, citations, the H-index and the HIA, across 146 academics from 5 major disciplines, was the first to present a comprehensive longitudinal and cross-disciplinary, the key contributions, comparison across 3 major data sources of citation data: Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. So in one sentence, a complete summary of the entire paper. But then we needed to obviously say what the actual results were. So our first result was that there was a consistent and reasonably stable quarterly growth for both publications and citations across the 3 databases, because we conducted this study longitudinally, looking at results every quarter for a period of 2 or 3 years. So all 3 data sources showed stable quarterly growth. Then the takeaway of this was that all 3 data sources provide sufficient stability of coverage to be used for cross-disciplinary comparisons. And that might seem like a really boring result for you, but in the field of bibliometrics, traditionally Google Scholar had not been recognized as a valid data source. So by comparing it to the Web of Science and Scopus and showing that it followed similar patterns to these established databases, we provided a key contribution. Then we had a second, slightly more interesting and possibly a little bit controversial contribution, which shows that the 3 data sources showed very different research metrics across the 5 major disciplines. So depending on the data source that you would pick, you would get a different result. But also depending on the metric that you would use, you would get a different result. And that is something that surprisingly, to some extent, had not been investigated in previous studies. So the second takeaway, which was what we ended our article with, because this is something that we really wanted to get across, is that we thought that a fair and inclusive comparison of research performance across disciplines is possible, in contrast to what most of the authors in the field of bibliometrics had said. They would have said that, okay, in the sciences and life sciences, you can use comparisons of citations, but you can't really do this in the social sciences and humanities, and you can do this in a very limited way only in engineering. We showed that this is possible across all 5 disciplines, provided that you use Google Scholar or possibly Scopus as a data source and not the Web of Science, and use a new metric that we introduced, the HI annual, which is a H index that is corrected for the length of someone's career and for the number of co-authors. So we thought this was quite a strong message to end on, in terms of, in contrast to all other research, we show that you can actually use research metrics for the social sciences and to a lesser extent humanities, but certainly also engineering, as long as you use the right data source and metrics. Here's an example of a completely different paper. This paper was really about how the concept of cultural distance has been consistently overemphasized in entry mode studies in international business. And it argues that it is far more useful to look at the specific cultural and institutional context of the home country and the host country rather than the distance between the two. Now, in this case, we wanted to focus mostly on the contributions. So we did lead with the contribution, but provided an implicit summary of the paper in the contribution. So first of all, we said that we feel that our paper has made 2 significant contributions, with the first one showing that any future study in international business that looks at the impact of any distance dimension on any kind of empirical phenomenon, not just the one we studied in this paper, or using any distance-based approach, would need to include several carefully chosen home and host countries in their sample. Because if you have only one home country and 5 host countries, you might actually be studying a host country effect. If you have only one host country and 5 home countries, you might be studying a home country effect. So you need several carefully chosen home and host countries to be able to differentiate the effect of distance from the effect of home and host country context. So this was our first contribution. And then our second contribution was that we established empirically, because we also had empirical data, that the home and host country context actually had a higher explanatory power for entry mode choice, the topic that we focused on in our paper, and possibly for other international business phenomena. We hedging our bets, but we're saying this might well be true for other international business phenomena than the Kogut and Singh based distant concept. And the Kogut and Singh based distant concept is one of the core concepts in international business. So we then ended again with advocacy, a clear call for action in future research, recommending that studies in international business focus first and foremost on the home and the host country context, and resist the temptation to just say everything is due to cultural distance and use this as a sort of catch-all concept. And that's given the illusion of causality between distance and the phenomenon of interest. We argue that this illusion of causality and the emphasis of cultural distance hinders the potential of our international business research to provide useful guidance to managers on key international business phenomena. So again, a strong sense of advocacy at the end of the article. As we've just discussed, the core of the 5th session of this writing bootcamp is about writing an effective conclusion. As promised though, I will also briefly discuss the strategic role of referencing throughout your paper, as well as the remaining elements of your paper, the literature review, the methods, the results section and the discussion section. So, the role of references. Well, 90 to 95% of the references are simply there in your paper to support your arguments on a sentence by sentence level. So your only decision here is which sentences need support from the literature, and if so, how many references do you use. This blog post that I've referenced here might give some useful pointers in this respect. You can also use references very strategically though, especially in the introduction section. If you use references strategically, they are used as signposts. They are signals that you are part of the same conversation as your readers. So by referencing particular key pieces of work that they are familiar with, they know that you're acknowledging voices in the field. In this way, there are also shortcuts that can save you hundreds of words, because if you reference a key conceptual framework, a theoretical position, or a particular research method, it only takes you a few words, but the reader will read the hundreds of words behind this reference because they know the reference intimately. So how do you use references strategically? As I mentioned in the previous slides, you can, for instance, reference core theoretical publications in your literature review. If you are talking about social capital, Bourdieu would be a core reference. If you talk about social identity theory, Teufel would be a core reference. You can also reference core methodological publications that align with your own research philosophy. So, for instance, in qualitative data analysis, there are very different methods to analyze data, and each method has its own core authors. So decide what the core research method is you're using and use the referencing appropriately to signal this. We've also talked about how important it is to make sure that you signal that you're part of the journal's conversation. So you do need to reference key and recent publications in the journal that you submit to. But you need to do this for legitimate reasons. Don't do this to flatter the editor, to bribe the editor and say, I'm going to reference papers in your journal to inflate your journal impact factor. No, you're only referencing these key and recent publications if they are important to your argument. However, if you're finding that you cannot find a single reference in the journal that you're submitting to, a single paper in the journal that you're submitting to, that is worth referencing in your paper, you might want to ask yourself whether this is the right outlet for it anyway. If you can only find references in the journal that are 10, 15, 20 years old that are relevant for your argument, you really need to think about whether you can add something new to the old conversation going on in this journal. Then finally, it would also be strategic to reference the editor and or the likely reviewers for this paper. And obviously, you're not going to just reference them for the sake of it, to flatter or bribe them. But if an editor or a reviewer, a likely reviewer, has written about the same topic that you discuss in your paper, and you're completely ignoring their work, they're not really going to like that very much. You wouldn't like that either if you were a reviewer and the author had completely ignored your previous work in the field. So make an extra effort to find out whether the editor or the reviewers have published anything in your topic area. So in the bootcamp, we have so far focused on 4 distinct elements of your paper: the title, the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. Obviously, that's not all there is to an academic article. You also have a literature review, a methods section, a results section, and usually a discussion section. They are obviously hugely important in your paper, but the exact content and details in terms of the length and how they are written up really differ very much by discipline and journal, and also by research method that you're using. So for these sections, I recommend that you really use your model articles to see how they are written up in the journal that you are submitting to. I can give you a few kind of general recommendations though. If we start with the literature review, you really need to make sure that it's focused on your key concepts and research questions. And in discussing these, demonstrate how your article fills a research gap. And this is the section where you can talk about a gap in the literature. So the literature review is not like showing off everything that you've read, which you often do in a master's thesis or a PhD thesis. Like it's almost like you've covered the entire bookcase full of books. It's also not about your struggles in finding the right framing, sort of a detective story. Well, I first tried this and then I tried that and then I finally settled on this. No, it's about a straightforward journey on your key concepts and showing how they relate to your research question and where you make a new contribution. So don't waffle, don't wander into side discussions that are maybe interesting but not core to your paper. Stay focused. So then the last 3 sections, the methods, results and discussion. The methods section is usually relatively straightforward. You provide a comprehensive discussion of the sample, the measures that you've used to measure your concepts, and the method of analysis. If you use any unusual samples, any unusual measures, or any unusual analysis, you spend a little bit more time explaining these. In the blog post I reference at the bottom of the slide, for instance, talks about how to write for US journals with non-US data. So unusual samples in that a lot of studies take the US as the benchmark. So if you're doing research in a different country, you will need to explain why this is of relevance, not just to the audience in that particular country, but also in the rest of the world and in the US as well. If you use a particular type of analysis that is not really that common in the journal that you're submitting to, or in the wider fields that that journal is a part of, for instance, experiments are very, very common in psychology and in behavioral economics, but they're not at all common in management. So if you use experimental research in management, you might need to do a little bit more explaining about why you do this and how you do this. Then the results section, again, usually a relatively straightforward section that simply reports your results. Especially for quantitative results, it can be quite a short section as well that follows a fairly standard template. In qualitative research, this section is often quite long. And it can also include elements that in quantitative research you would include in the discussion section instead. Then the discussion section, that's one that probably differs most by discipline. It's extremely important in management journals and to some extent in marketing journals as well. In management journals, it has a really strict structure in most journals, where you first of all provide a summary of your results. Then you explain how your results contribute to theory and how they develop a particular theory. Then you look at the managerial or societal implications of your research. And then you discuss the limitations of your own research and make suggestions for future research that might address these limitations. In other disciplines, economics, finance, sociology, history, the discussion section is often less important and less extensive than in management and marketing, and it's often differently named. Sometimes it's just named conclusion, and it includes what will be included in the discussion section in management and marketing and a concluding section. But a lot of the elements that I discussed above, the summary, the contributions to theory, some societal implications, limitations of your research, future research, would still be discussed in some way. Okay, we've just talked about the importance of strategic referencing, and I've given you some brief pointers on what's important for the literature review, the methods, the results, and the discussion section. But the main topic of the 5th session of the writing bootcamp was really about writing an effective conclusion section. So this will be what we will focus on in the live session for session 5. And just as in the previous sessions, we will start with a Q&A about this recording. So if you have any questions, you'll have a chance to ask those. But then we'll go into breakout rooms again, and hopefully we'll have a bootcamp mentor in each of the breakout rooms. Then you can decide whether you want to work on your conclusion with someone else in the breakout room, with your bootcamp mentor, on your own. But your bootcamp mentor will be there if you get stuck. If you have any questions for me, then feel free to come back to the main room, because that's where I will be with my own group. And I will bring all of you back about 10 minutes before the end of the session. So if you're looking for inspiration for examples of effective conclusions, I've discussed 2 of those in this recording, but the full slide deck for the Writing Bootcamp has lots more examples. Now, if you're someone who prefers to read rather than listen to presentations like this, I've also written up this presentation in 8 blog posts as part of a series. So as you will see from the titles, they basically cover all of the steps that we also cover in this bootcamp. So if you look at the bottom part of this slide, you will see the URL of the first installment of this blog post. I hope this session has given you some useful tips about how to write an effective concluding section, but also how to use references strategically throughout the article. The next session, which is already the last session, will talk about why it is important to write a letter to the editor and make sure your paper is proofread.